We're standing at the top of the Lookout Point Dam on the middle fork of the Willamette River. It's a beautiful view up here, watching the tree-lined river flow through the valley into the distance. We're here on a tour with biologist Greg Taylor of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the federal agency in charge of operating dams along the Willamette.
This is our largest storage facility in the Willamette.
We step forward.
If you don't like heights, well, we'll see.
And very carefully look over the edge of this monumental structure to see where water passes through to the other side.
These are our spillway gates right here. And then we got the powerhouse, and it's got a set of intakes associated with the units there. So really, those are our conduits for passing water downstream.
To survive and thrive, young salmon the size of baby carrots must get past this towering wall of concrete on their way to the ocean. But more than half of them die here on that journey each year. Looking down from these heights, it's not hard to imagine how perilous the crossing can be for such teensy tiny young fish just trying to survive. It's wild to think that this part of the river was once home to the most abundant salmon populations in the Willamette Valley. Down at the base of the dam, we visit a room filled with floor-to-ceiling machinery. In a sense, this is where it all happens. From this control room, being run today by an operator named Shane Jones.
And this is Shane, by the way.
The Corps can control not just one, but 9 different Willamette dams.
Shane is making decisions that can kill people, that have life and death implications. The water that Shane releases is ultimately what these fish experience.
The choices made here by the Army Corps have huge implications for the million-year-old salmon population on the Willamette, fish that are so central to the identity of this river and the people who live here. Fish that are increasingly in danger. The Corps has proposed building huge, expensive new contraptions to try to save the salmon. But will they even work? From the newsroom of OPB, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. Today, the story of how a tax-funded federal agency continues to double down on costly feats of engineering to reverse environmental catastrophes its own engineers created.
Biologists were really fearing that these fish are on the edge of extinction.
OPB investigative reporter and editor Tony Schick covered this story for OPB and Propublica, and he's with me today to help break it all down. Tony, hello. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so the Lookout Point Dam, where we were just a moment ago, is one of more than a dozen dams built on the Willamette back in the mid-20th century. So why were these dams built in the first place? What would they be used for?
Yeah, so if you look at old photos sometimes of the Willamette Valley or of downtown Portland, you'll see during big floods, basically parts of the cities are underwater.
Yeah.
And these dams were built basically to say, if we're going to develop this part of Oregon, we need something for flood control. And so they were authorized initially under a Flood Control Act, although they were also built with hydropower and for the idea of storing water for various uses. And also, they impounded rivers to create lakes. And those are some pretty popular recreation sites today.
Yeah, absolutely. So salmon have existed on the Willamette for 1 million years, and native tribes with ancestral homelands here, like the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, have been fishing for salmon in this river for a very, very long time. And I know you met Michael Langley of the Grand Ronde tribes, and he shared stories with you about fishing with his family as a young man.
Yeah, so that's the head of the fish that you can see. Yeah, isn't that huge? And the mouth all wide open.
And he said that his father once caught a 53-pound salmon here, which is hard for me to even imagine. But those days are over. We know that in recent times, this fish population has been in a lot of trouble.
Since we're salmon people, we feel a really deep connection that as they go, we go. And so for us, if we were to abandon them, we're really just abandoning ourselves.
So, Tony, how did it become clear that these dams, which were built by white settlers in the Willamette Valley, were threatening salmon in this way? And how bad has that gotten today?
Yeah, so these dams, in some cases, block 100% of the spawning habitat. The Lookout Point Dam, where we started, that blocks almost 100% of the spawning habitat, the historic spawning habitat for salmon. So the salmon that, historically would have been born on that stretch of river would have been born in the gravel beds of the streams above that dam. They have to make their way past it, going out to the ocean, as all salmon do. And then they have to make their way past it coming back up. But it blocks their path both ways.
Yeah.
And for the adults, there's no way for them to get past these really high dams. So they are captured and then trucked back above the dams. But getting these fish past the dams on their way down the river for these young fish has really been an issue for decades. Populations of fish that were once in the tens of thousands are now in the thousands or hundreds. In recent years, like 2018 was an absolute record low where there were very, very few fish returning back over Willamette Falls, up the Willamette River. And biologists were really fearing that these fish are on the edge of extinction.
Fish recovery on the Willamette has repeatedly been a matter before the courts. In fact, in 2021, a federal judge weighed in on the worsening situation for salmon. U.S. District Judge Marco A. Hernandez did order the court to take one measure to help salmon, and it's something that has been effective before. This idea of drawing down reservoirs on the river, draining them to lower levels. What does this do in terms of helping salmon make it down the river?
Yeah, so when you draw down a reservoir and drain it to the point where it's functioning more like a river, you've got a constant flow, the salmon can ride that current, which is what they naturally do. And then the other thing is that they have to find a way through the dam, this giant wall. And sometimes they can't find any way through because some of the outlets in the dams are too deep. So drawing down this reservoir means the water level is low enough that salmon can ride the current and ride it through these outlets in the dams to the other side. And at one of the dams where they have tried it already, called Fall Creek Dam, which is set up in a way that they can really draw it down low and pass a lot of fish, they had incredible success, passing something like 99% of fish safely. And the Corps reported that they saw a tenfold increase in the number of adult salmon that came back.
Okay, now, on the other hand, the method the Corps is now proposing to help salmon is creating these structures called floating fish collectors. And one of these could be as big as a football field. Honestly, it's kind of challenging to wrap my head around what that would actually look like. Can you help us visualize one of these collectors and how it would work?
I can try. I've struggled with this a lot because it's not like anything you've ever seen before, really.
Yeah.
It looks like a floating industrial building. I told my editor that it looks like if government engineers had designed Jabba's prison barge or Jabba's sail barge, but that didn't make it into the story. And it's got an entrance to it in the water that is meant to pull in a lot of fish. And the fish are meant to think that is the current of the river and follow into that. Here's how Army Corps biologist Greg Taylor put it.
They're fish vacuums. They're pulling in water and fish and then keeping the fish and then safely transporting them downstream.
Fish vacuums.
Wow, giant fish vacuums. Okay, thank you for walking us through this. So nothing as large as what's being proposed by the Corps here has ever been tested, but smaller versions of these fish collectors have been tried before elsewhere. How did that go?
Yeah, it's pretty hit and miss. There are some that have been fairly effective. There's one on the Clackamas River that does collect a pretty high number of fish. That, however, has a lot of things going for it that the Willamette River dams don't have. There is a structure on the Lewis River in Washington, and a study that the Corps commissioned found that that collector was operating at about 3% collection efficiency of how many fish it was collecting.
Wow.
Corps biologist Greg Taylor, who we just heard from, he was frank with me about the level of uncertainty in what they're trying to accomplish here.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist to go back and look at how these structures have performed in other locations to see that there's been some challenges.
So what they have done is study those collectors and found that there are certain things that are correlated with better performance, like the size of the entrance of the collector. The more flow you have going into the collector, the bigger the vacuum, the more you're going to suck up. And so they have proposed fish collectors that are roughly 5 times bigger and more powerful than anything we've seen before.
Yeah. Besides this like idea of kind of supersizing this and like hopes of them being more effective, like looking at this mixed track record, why else does the Army Corps of Engineers feel like building fish collectors on the upper Willamette is the way to go here?
Well, they feel like this is what they have to do. The Corps says Congress has told us we need to operate for hydropower, water storage for irrigation, other purposes, recreation. We cannot just abandon these things. And so we can't draw the reservoirs down all the way across the system without impacting all of these. Given that, we have to find a solution that enables that. And they think that these fish collectors are that way. And, you know, when I ask them about the kind of gamble of that, given the cost and the stakes for salmon, Liza Wells, who is the deputy engineer for the Army Corps Portland District, explained that they really are trying to be creative given their constraints.
The people that work here are really trying hard to think of what the best ways are to tackle this really tough problem in the space we have.
Okay, so this is what the Corps is saying that the conditions they're trying to work under here. How do scientists and researchers outside of the Corps feel about all this?
There's a good amount of skepticism. Some of that has to do with the fact that this would amount to trapping and hauling salmon both downriver and back upriver. And that is a practice that a scientific review in 2017 found had never been done successfully. That paper concluded that any such program should proceed with extreme caution because two-way trap and haul will not save salmon, but only prolong their decline to extinction. I spoke with the lead author, Robert Lasardi, who's a researcher at University of California, Davis, and here's what he had to say about that practice.
Transportation of fish, whether it's juvenile or adult, has really seismic effects on the fish themselves.
I'm wondering, with all of this emphasis on providing hydropower as one of the dam's uses, what folks in the actual industry that uses this hydropower say about this plan. Are they advocating for a solution like this also?
They are not. They are. This is a scenario in which the hydropower industry, fish advocates, tribes are actually aligned. On the Willamette, hydropower is kind of a secondary benefit of these dams in a way. They are not efficient at generating hydropower compared to elsewhere in the region. Here is Scott Sims, executive director of the Public Power Council.
In the case of the Willamette projects, what we're seeing is a very low amount of power output with a very high associated cost of that power.
Under the Corps' plan that does preserve hydropower, hydropower operations would lose $700 million over the 30 years of the plan.
Okay.
And lighting a home with electricity from those dams would be something like 5 times the cost of a dam on the Columbia. And so the hydropower industry wants hydropower actually shut down at these dams.
What about the other economic purposes of the dams that the Corps say are important? Did you hear from people who'd be the beneficiaries of these uses about what they think about this plan?
Yeah, and it's different from hydropower where they're saying get rid of it. There are people who do rely on some of these reservoirs to store water, recreation being a big one of them. And there have been impacts to recreation. But some of those can be mitigated by things like building boat ramps that go deeper into the water for when the reservoirs aren't as high, dredging underneath marinas. And then even as some of these dams have been drawn down under this injunction, the State Parks Department said that recreation has still been going up.
Oh, okay.
It's just shifting where it's going. I spoke with Don O'Donnell, who is owner of Float My Boat, a boat rental company near Fall Creek Dam and Lookout Point dams that have both been drawn down very low. And here's what she had to say.
It's kind of like, human error, fixing human error after human error after human error. And how can we make it right now that we've ruined it?
She wasn't the biggest fan of the drawdown. She wasn't necessarily a huge believer that they would work. She was pretty skeptical that anything the Corps would do could work, but she was happy that they were trying something for the salmon. And she said her business has been fine since some of these lakes have been drawn down. She's just kind of shifted elsewhere.
I want to go back to Michael Langley, who we heard from earlier. He was a former tribal council member for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And in a letter the tribes wrote to the Army Corps in February 2023, they characterized the Corps' plans as, quote, killing salmon to lose money. What did he tell you about the tribe's perspective on all this?
Yeah, so Michael, remember earlier we talked about that giant salmon that his dad had caught. That he had
like
all that
53
picture of,
pounds.
Yeah, and the tracing of it. And he was talking about like how that's what they would love to get to is salmon populations that are that healthy, right? But as he told me,
the way we're doing it right now, it's more likely to lead to extinction.
they are very concerned about the state of the salmon, and they think that it should be dealt with a lot more urgency. And they have been trying to draw attention to the fact that there are fairly readily available potential solutions. And the alternative is going to be really, really costly. So they're trying to appeal to not just, for the sake of the salmon, but also just as a taxpayer, what do you value? This has been a long fight for them. Mm-hmm. This is a collection of tribes that were, separated from the river that they called home and lost their status through the Tribal Termination Acts. And they have really been building back to this for a long time. And Michael was talking about how he is always able to remind himself of why he does this.
I bought this ring. It's two salmon together, and it's for me. It's my daily reminder from my dad, and my grandpa, to keep this fight going for salmon. And I feel like sometimes this ring's pretty heavy. Sometimes I feel like we're not doing enough. But I know it isn't just me. I wear this ring to push myself, but there's a lot of us out there that feel the same way.
Tony, I will say, since you first reported on these proposed fish collectors, a wrinkle in this story has come to light. The reservoir drawdowns that we've been talking about were reported to have caused muddy water to flow into the drinking water systems in some Willamette Valley cities in late 2023. What have you learned about that? And has that changed this debate at all?
Yeah, it certainly has changed the debate. So there was an expectation that anytime you flush a reservoir, you're going to get sediment flowing downstream because it's been building up in that reservoir. There was an understanding from the Corps and from scientists of what happens there. Something perhaps was underestimated in terms of how muddy those waters were going to be for some communities like Sweet Home that were dealing with significant, it's called turbidity in their water. And what that means is their water was never unsafe to drink, but it was taxing their water treatment program, their plant. So basically they had to run it harder than they were before, use a little bit more chemical to treat the water. And so people didn't really like the way that the water coming out of their tap was looking or tasting as well as they used to. Remember, these are places that have some of the best tasting water in the world. And so it was kind of a shock for residents there. Now, that did let up once the rains came and filled those reservoirs back up, and it was an expectation. And it is something that a lot of the people pushing for these drawdowns say can be mitigated. You could, pay for these treatment plants to be bolstered. There's also the fact that you could operate the drawdowns differently if you did them perhaps slower or eased into it. And it's also important to note that sediment built up in there because the reservoirs were there for so long without being drained. If you're draining them every year, that sediment's not going to build up. You're not going to get this every single year. Studies have shown that after the first couple of years, that really levels off.
You have been reporting on the situation for salmon in the Pacific Northwest for a long time. What draws you towards reporting on this specific topic, on salmon in the Northwest? What do you feel like is so significant about this story for people in our region right now?
I think it's because salmon are so integral to the identity of the Northwest. One of my favorite definitions for what the Pacific Northwest is, I think, comes from a Tim Egan book, and it's wherever the salmon can get to. And they are, an emblem that immediately makes you think of the Pacific Northwest. And they're on the carpet of the state capitol building. And we populated towns to fish for salmon. We sacrifice them for the hydropower that lights up our cities. And the trees in the forests that are so iconic in Oregon wouldn't grow the way they do if it weren't for the salmon dying bodies that are full of ocean nutrients. Just they shape the Northwest in so many ways, and they're so integral to our lives. And now we're at a time when we have driven them so close to the brink of extinction, and they're going to be hit so hard by climate change that this thing that is so central to our identity as people in the Pacific Northwest is in the balance.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for your reporting on this and for being with us today to talk to me about this.
Thank you.
That was OPB investigative reporter and editor Tony Schick. You can read his story about salmon and Willamette River dams, a collaboration between OPB and Propublica at opb.org. And Tony's been doing a lot more reporting on salmon in the Northwest lately. In fact, he's got a whole new podcast series about it. And I deeply appreciate how it centers Indigenous voices who tell us that story. It's called Salmon Wars, and it's really something. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. If you're here listening right now, you are a part of our brand new podcast family, and we are glad you're here. Help us grow by leaving a review on your favorite podcast app. Follow us there, and hey, tell your friends. This episode was produced by yours truly. Our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered this episode. Our theme music comes from Audio Network. The mighty OPB podcast team also includes Julie Sabatier, Mia Estrada, and Sage Van Wing. And Tony Schick did the interviews you heard. If you have a question for us, please hit us up. You can reach us by email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.